All right. It's telling me I'm live, so I think we're live now.
Great.
So I'm Nick, Sync Logistics Training, and I've been trying to do these monthly webinars around different L&D topics. I say monthly, but realistically, I haven't done them since like September, so I'm trying to get them rolling again. Today, like the goal of these webinars is just kind of address certain like L&D or training topics, but it kind of approach them very specifically from the lens of the transportation industry. And to do that, like we bring in folks who have experience in both like learning development and transportation. That way we talk about this in a way that's actually relevant to people in the industry. And today we're going to specifically talk about like the role of leadership in training. And at least in my experience, it's a really important topic because what I see with some of our customers and people I talk to is that they'll hire a trainer and then leadership tends to be very hands off at that point, right? Like the mentality is just, well, like we've got this trainer, it's their person's job now, and I can kind of hang out over here doing other leadership things, which in my experience just isn't the most effective way to go about things. So we're going to talk today about just what leaders can do to kind of make their training programs more effective. And just as context, when I say leaders, I'm talking about someone with like one or more direct reports. And with that being said, that's the end of my spiel. We'll go around and do a quick round of intros here. So, Amy, do you want to kick things off?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Amy Malin. I'm currently working as the founder and sole member of Malin Learning, aka I do lots of fractional and contract L&D related work under my LLC. Prior to that, I was at Uber Freight for a few years in a training role. And then after that, at Project 44 in a global learning and development role as well. So my experience really ranges in everything from new hire onboarding to role-specific training, product enablement, manager training, et cetera, all within the logistics space, which is something I am super passionate about. That's a little bit about me, and I'm located here in Chicago.
All right, perfect. Erica, you want to go next?
All right, sure. I'm Erica Winston. I manage the training and development at Sunset Transportation. Our headquarters are in St. Louis, Missouri. And then prior to this, so I've been at Sunset for a little over 4 years, but prior to this, I was a freight broker for almost 5 years at a produce company. So I have a freight broker background and a passion for teaching other people how to be freight brokers. So I'm really excited to talk about leadership in this capacity.
And you're a second-time guest for us. So
second-time
congratulations, I guess.
Yes.
And Kristen, go for it.
Yeah, she must have been done okay the first time. Got an invite back.
She did a good job.
I'm Kristen Klein. I'm currently a sales manager for Q'd. We do appointment scheduling automation. I previously to Q'd was at GIX Logistics, where I was the training and development manager. And I started at GIX coming out of a brief career in education, and applied for a broker position, brokered for a while. And then we, like many others in the industry during COVID, experienced just a ton of growth and a lot of hiring. And so at that time, I, as an educator, just saw such a need for like formalizing our training at GIX, and approached our vice president and said, hey, I think I could be good at this. And he just let me run with things. So got to develop training and development for that brokerage, and still stay really involved operationally, and especially with new technology and training that. So got to do that for GIX prior to joining the Q'd team. So yeah.
Cool.
Grand Island, Nebraska is where I'm located.
Nice. Training and technology should be another webinar that we do. We'll talk about that independently after this. But like the way I usually do these is we start kind of broad and then kind of get like more granular with our questions. So I'm going to kick things off with a very broad topic of just like, what's your view on the role of leadership with respect to employee training, and just what are some kind of overarching key points folks should keep in mind? Amy, do you want to start things?
Sure. So I think my perspective on this has certainly changed over the years, and it's honestly depended on my own career evolution as well. I was a late entry in life into learning and development. So prior, I was in sales for a number of years. Liked telling the client about the product way more than I cared about them actually buying anything, hence kind of facilitating this move into L&D and more of the full-time teaching. But I say all that to add some context to the fact that when I started kind of over in my career a little bit later in life, I was a training specialist and I was doing like the brass tacks, new hire onboarding, role specific training, et cetera, et cetera. And when I joined the corporate in an L&D capacity in that role, I remember really thinking that it was my duty to make sure that like everyone was trained on what they needed to know. Like I was L&D, managers had their own stuff to worry about. If I didn't know it and I couldn't teach it to them, I wasn't doing my job right. And over time, as I myself have become a manager and have also led teams before, and also, of course, as technology has changed and the kind of work we do has changed as well, I've really come to see the value of not positioning yourself in L&D as the be-all, end-all for all of the trainings. Because at the end of the day, what happens is once someone leaves your classroom, they're no longer yours. And they weren't your direct reports to begin with anyway. So if we think about the learner and them reporting to a manager who's other than you in L&D, we really need to make sure that the managers are on the same page with the content that we're teaching and that managers are positioned to be able to coach to that material after the person leaves the training or completes the e-learning. AKA they need to check in on their completion rates. They need to be asking them questions about it in their one-on-one. They need to be coaching to what we taught in the original training. So all of this will vary depending on the subject matter expert. But I think, again, if I was to kind of like summarize my takeaway, it is I used to think that as L&D, management did not need to be involved in training. They just needed to tell me what they wanted training on and I had it handled. Now that cannot be further from the case. I need managers like fully involved in everything I am doing to the extent that they are almost doing it more so than I am. And my subject matter expertise really lays in the training design, the facilitation, and helping with that knowledge transfer afterward.
Yeah, I think those are all great points. I mean, my experience is that a lot of brokers kind of see training it's almost happening in a vacuum, right? Like everything happens over there in the training area and like it's not really impacted by everything else that's going on. But like to me, the reality is that like managers and everyone at the company really is going to have some sort of involvement, both kind of like pre-training, during training, and then after training to follow up to make sure that it like is actually effective. But I'll let you guys talk.
I can relate to how you used to feel, Amy, because I'm kind of experiencing that at Sunset. So almost 3 years ago is really when I started building this training department. And I do think that most of the leaders thought that they just hand their employee to me, I train them, and then it's over. But over time, I've gotten adoption from all of the leaders in the organization, and it's taken a lot of time. But I think now I'm getting them to realize that training needs to continue after they leave the classroom. So I would say in order to make training effective, you need to communicate with the leaders of your organization first about what you're going to do. A perfect example, I actually just did this yesterday and today. I'm hosting a live training session internally for our employees about freight seasonality. And before announcing it to the organization, I sent separate communication to all of the managers and up about what I was going to do so that they could help support me and hype up the training session. Once I sent out the announcement, the class filled up within less than 5 minutes, which is the coolest thing ever. This is the first time we're doing something so formal like this. So yeah, communication is key because if you don't keep those leaders looped in, your efforts aren't really going to go far. So,
Kristen, anything to add for that before I jump into something else here?
Well, just the whole time, all I'm thinking about is just how important communication is, because for me, I answered directly to our vice president. He was not thinking about training and development all day long. He was thinking about, you know, what our bottom line is and how the month is going. And like training and development was just not his number one priority. He was extremely supportive of me, but if I was not communicating clearly with him on, you know, what was on my desk and what challenges I was having, but especially with those middle managers who you hand off new trainees to, like my job would just never have worked. So communicate, like I always thought I was a good communicator. Like that's something that comes really natural to me. And then coming into that role, you're just really forced to level up in your communication to be extremely clear. You know, even just written communication. I'm sure we'll get into this, just the idea of, you know, what's the most effective way for people to learn, and are they getting the information the way that they need to understand, and everyone learns differently. And yeah, just like having support in that, but especially just leveling up in your own communication is just so necessary for the position.
So you, like Eric and Kristen, you both touched on like communication, and I told you I was going to completely go rogue off of these questions that I've got. So here we go. So I guess like, what do you mean by that? What types of things do you, as someone in an L&D role, need to be communicating to the managers at your company?
I think it really comes down to just responsibility. So I need you to know that this is what I'm training. And just because I train it doesn't mean that they're going to remember and do it perfectly every single time, even though they did it perfectly a few times with me. It might need reinforced on your end. And so just really communicating, like, I need you to follow up with
action items. Something that I've gotten a lot better at is providing action items. Okay. So I'll, you know, have a learning initiative, and then I will present the results back to the managers. But then what, you know? So I have to give them actionable items. Please review these missed questions one-on-one with your team and you know, help them understand why this is the right answer. And sometimes I'll even go a little bit further and be like, report back to me after you've done this. So yes, you have to be very specific, because I mean, at Sunset, this is something completely new. We can't just expect our leaders to just know how to do this stuff. We have to help them get there.
Something that really stuck out to me when I first trained as a broker, and remember, I came from education. So in my mind, the whole time as I'm training, I'm like, oh, guys, this is not great. But it was like learning by doing and sitting in the chair and like learning by, you know, booking the load. So Tiffany is who trained me. Tyler was my supervisor at the time. And I remember Tiffany forgot to train me on something like a little procedure that we had when we took a loss on a load. And so that procedure was to simply like put a comment in the load that said loss for our accounting department. She never told me that. Of course, new broker, occasionally we lost money. Had to put a loss comment in, didn't do it. And Tyler was like, oh, you didn't put your loss comment in. I was like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And I remember he like fired off a chat to Tiffany that was like, hey, don't forget to train on loss comments. And Tiffany's like, oh yeah, got it. You know, forgot that. No big deal. Just this little thing. That stuck with me forever, especially as I transitioned to the new position, because like there's just so many little things like that to track and to communicate. And every time you train someone, procedures are constantly changing. There's always something like, oh, hey, what about this? And that's just the perfect example of like, even though you're taught that maybe in training, like you're not always going to retain that in that situation. I wasn't taught that, but I remembered that coming into the role, like there's so many of those little one-offs that come in, and, you know, the trainer can't get everything, but tries to.
Yeah.
Oh, totally. Amy, were you going to add something?
So I think just to like quickly piggyback on that communication part, and then I think like Kristen, this builds on what you just said in terms of like these new knowledge things that pop up, and like the tribal knowledge that people have combined with the fact that we're asking managers to kind of like take this role in L&D that maybe they haven't had to before. I think just something that's always, and like we all know this on this call, but for anyone listening, I think it's also just important to like recognize that no one who is a manager, or most likely the majority of them, don't necessarily want to just like shirk all responsibilities off to L&D. I think a lot of the times if we go back to communication, it's, oh, hey, we have this like fancy new L&D team in place. It can be interpreted as, okay, great, here's this resource who's going to take care of this for us. And so it really is on us to be really clear in terms of like, this is what we can do, and this is what we cannot do, and what we will not do, and what we need your partnership on. So I think just something that I have also kind of come to learn over time is to be wary of just like making assumptions that like all managers don't want to train, or like all managers do want to train, and really just kind of leading with a really blank slate in terms of whether we've worked together or not. These are my expectations for my role, and again, your role as well, because a lot of times that's just not clear. Not a lot of people intentionally don't want to do that. I think to Kristen's point around like things that have changed, it's interesting because I used to, as a more junior trainer, also thought that like my role was to update SOPs. And I would offer to do this and say like, and I like writing. So I'd be like, great, I will literally make your SOP for you. Okay, well, there's a problem there, which is it's a brokerage. This process is going to change as our tech changes. I, as the L&D person, I am not the one who is like always in the nitty gritty in it and able to update that SOP. And so when it comes down to communications, I think additionally just being really clear in terms of I own these resources, and these are point in time resources. So if other things change moving forward, be that within the deck that I use, the training I used, I will update it on X cadence. But for other things like SOPs, job aids, etc., this is something that, X person who is not an L&D needs to have ownership of. So again, this can probably all just be summarized by communication and expectation setting, bolded, underlined, but definitely would agree with a lot of the points that Erica and Kristen have brought up around that.
So I think like the three of you have kind of, like Erica, I know you mentioned specifically the word like adoption from leaders, and the three of you have kind of like talked around different things that involve that. Like, what can you do to kind of drive adoption from your leadership team? Like, I forget who talked about giving them action items and stuff like that. Probably Erica. Like, how do you make sure they do them? Like I can easily imagine a scenario where somebody gives a leader a bunch of action items or things that they should be doing with the trainers, but the leader is just like, okay, like I'll do these when I can get to them. Like, how do you actually drive adoption from these?
I mean, the number one thing is create strong relationships with the leaders in your organization, because they're more likely to listen to you and trust you. If you don't interact with leaders in your organization at all, and you just give them action items, they're going to blow you off. So it's just really important to have meaningful, strong relationships with all of them, whether it's like, I don't know, catching up for coffee one morning or going out to lunch with them. It is just super important to get face time with leaders at every level of the organization. That's what I found works best for me.
On that same note, something that I did, and this was probably a little bit specific to the size of the brokerage I was at and just the nature of the team that I worked with. Previous to my position, I was a broker. And so I had that operational knowledge. But once you get out of that broker seat and now you're training, you're kind of stuck at where you last left operationally with your knowledge. So for me, I was really adamant that I did shadowing with brokers, that I did shadowing with managers, that I would cover for brokers when they were gone if I didn't have anyone to train. I just really wanted to have street credit operationally so that I had the respect that what I was coaching and training was relevant to what they were doing every single day. And the second that I felt like I didn't entirely know, or I had a phone call, like I would answer the phones during my job just because I wanted to stay in the loop and stay fresh, because it's you can lose that quickly, if at least in the setting I was at, if you're not staying engaged in that way. And so that really got, for me, I gained respect that way from other managers because they knew I knew how to cover for their position or for their broker's position.
So
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Amy.
Same thing as Kristen and Erica said, the relationship piece is huge, and like proving, I think, that you're like willing to like go into the trenches and not just teach, but also do. I sat with the carrier sales team as much as I possibly could. And like I worked a few Saturday shifts with like, I was like, I'm teaching people to do this, so I should be able to like sell some loads. Granted, I was nervous as all hell, knowing that like people could actually hear me talking to truck drivers. And I was like, oh God, like this is what I'm asking all of you to do. I can't believe you actually do this stuff now. But it was just a really eye-opening experience for me and gave me real life examples that I could then draw on. Additionally, you never know when those like serendipitous connections you've made through your shadowing or through your time with other people end up opening up other opportunities in L&D that you didn't know existed in the org. And you can then help kind of be a proponent of those as well.
Yeah. So one thing I'll add to the kind of like leadership adoption concept, I see Georgette in the comments here, and she reminded me of, like, just seeing her reminded me of a story that she did. So at her brokerage Mode, before giving training to seat level users, sorry, Georgette, if I'm butchering the story, but before giving like our training to seat level users, she actually had like their managers go through the training first, just kind of get their buy-in. And I remember she sent me their feedback. She had everyone to go through feedback forms. And I'll never forget, one of the comments was basically like, hey, Georgette, you made us go through this training. I really didn't want to do it. I thought it was going to be a complete waste of time, but you made me. And like, lo and behold, I did learn some things that I had forgotten about. Like, I know Billy on the floor right now is not doing X, Y, Z things. So like, yes, you have my buy-in and my blessing. Go ahead, make all of our users go through this training too. And like, just by having the managers actually like see what was in it and kind of get their buy-in that way was super effective. I tell that story a lot. Thanks, Georgette.
I think, Nick, adding a component of for the managers in the trainings that we do as well can really help kind of bring everyone together and also help kind of tie in the action items automatically. For instance, like I remember we were training on a new process. And one of the things we did was have everyone attend the training, including managers. And then we had a manager only training where we actually repeated a lot of the material. And then we added in a manager action item section where we said, okay, based off of everything that your direct reports have already seen, that you have now seen twice, these are kind of the additional, items that will help you maximize the output of your team after this training. So it added time. And at the same point in time, I think for things like new procedures that can have substantial revenue impact, it's so important that you spend that extra time up front, again, communicating, setting those expectations, but also bringing managers into the journey and kind of like laying it out for them.
Do you ever, so you mentioned revenue impact, like for me, like when selling training to brokerages, like that's an important selling point for me when talking to leaders and getting them to understand the value of training. Like, do you as like an internal trainer ever bring like those metrics up with leaders to get them on board?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's tough because correlation does not necessarily equal causation, but I think there are things that you can think of in terms of hours spent prior to a training on something versus hours after, and equating that to what would the cost of paying an employee to do this be. I think there are other numbers that you can look at as well. So for onboarding, if we look at retention numbers and the cost of someone starting and then leaving the company and needing to backfill the role, that's a great number to look at as well. So anywhere where it's like kind of what are these efficiency gains that we can try to translate into numbers, that's where you can, again, make a reasonable assumption that there is a correlation at least between what we implemented and what are some of the new numbers that we're seeing. It does require that there's that pre-assessment as well. And so one thing that I try to do when I do a training intake is really get the answer from the leader in terms of what does this look like now and what does success look like after the training and how do we measure that? And I say, I need your help with that because the last thing I want to do is have my team and myself spend my quarter on this and then we have nothing else to show for it except some really nice slides that we did. Like that's our job. Like we'll do those. And I need your help in making sure that we are measuring this and proving that we had impact. So never be scared to ask for the leader's help in how we can measure that as well. And just say like, I need to be able to do that.
So like we're talking about measuring stuff, which ties into one of the actual discussion questions I have. Like what metrics should leaders like track and use to evaluate the effectiveness of their training programs? Do you have any thoughts on that one? Anybody?
Well, I think for me, when I first pitched the role, I could see leaders and managers on the floor taking time away from what they were doing very well to slow way down and train a new hire. So really, anytime you can present data on time and what time is valued at your company, like those people, it made no sense for them to stop leading and doing what they were doing, even though they were incredible leaders with an incredible impact, to slow way down for a new hire at a time where you're hiring maybe a lot. Like it made more sense for me to slow down in that role. And that was kind of my big sales pitch, was like, this is why this could work for our company. I have the time to slow down and to do this slowly. We really valued, training by doing. And so like, walking through the steps and not just like reading instructions on training and testing on training, things like that. Like it was very much hands-on, but you need someone to ensure that you're not developing bad habits. And so to take that on in a training and development role, as opposed to from a management position, just to be able to say, I don't know how much, I like crunch the numbers. How much is that time valued? If you take a whole week away from your desk so that you're training somebody hands-on the way that we wanted to, that is a waste of money, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's something that I'm working on. Definitely one of my weaknesses is measuring training effectiveness. So one of the things that we're doing at Sunset to kind of help measure our efforts and measure retention is we're having quarterly knowledge checks. So they're administered through our LMS, and each quarter will be a different topic. So like our TMS is McLeod. So for Q1, everybody in track and trace got 10 McLeod questions. Everybody in carrier sales got 10 McLeod questions, and everybody in account management got 10 McLeod questions. And we kind of just looked at the data. Is this something that we need to retrain people on? Or was the question just worded poorly? So that's what we're starting to do. And we've just finished Q1 results. So I don't know if that's an idea for anybody, but that's what we started.
What did everybody do?
What?
How did everyone do?
Honestly, it was a lot better than I thought. The majority of the organization was like 85% or higher getting a question correct. We had about 5 questions that scored very low. So I mentioned this in the first webinar I was in, but we have a training steering committee that meets once a month. So we went over the questions that were missed the most as an organization and discussed why. And there were a couple controversial ones that sparked some debates. And so, we were like, do we need to change our training materials? Or maybe we need to just have a conversation with our managers that they need to hold everybody accountable to be doing this correctly in the system. So it's been good.
Yeah. So something that like we try to do with our customers is like one of you guys mentioned this earlier, is like at least having metrics on the starting point, which can in and of itself be a challenge at some brokerages. But like we try to get them to actually like have some idea of their metrics in terms of like, okay, like loads booked per day, margin numbers, carrier reuse stats and stuff like that. That way, 2 months from now, after someone's actually gone through a little bit more training, either as a new hire or as a more experienced employee who's going through some like review of stuff, like how do those metrics change, right? Or if you can track it from different new hire classes, like do you have any metrics on new hire classes before you did any training, or where your training was just like, hey, go sit with like Bobby over there and like learn from him for 2 weeks, and then compare that with the results after like implementing an actually like effective training program and just see how they change, But again, having that starting point can sometimes be a challenge.
Absolutely.
I think that's a really good point because something that I think we did really well was the new hire side of training and really formalizing that process. It was like down pat, but something that could have been better, I think, on my end was that tribal knowledge. It's like, Erica, you mentioned McLeod. There's a million, and I'm sure this is true for many TMSs, but there's a million ways to do the same thing. And everyone kind of
Oh
does,
yeah.
depending on how long they've been there, depending on, who showed them, who they sat by at one point. And so like to really exchange information from within a team, because they just get so caught up on their own process. Sometimes introducing something new feels like a waste of time, or it feels, like not necessary, but really you can just drive efficiency by leaning on the people sitting next to you. And so from a training and development standpoint, like learning that and implementing those new ways of showing you how to do the same thing, but maybe faster. Um, that's something that I didn't feel like I was great at because I didn't always make the time for it. But I just think it's so important, again, for that bottom line of toward efficiency for a company.
So I'm going to back up to one of like my earlier questions here that I didn't talk about, just because I think this is something that like I'd love to actually get some like specific examples from you guys. But like, what challenges come up when leaders aren't involved in training? Like, I'd love to hear from like your experience, what challenges you see at different brokerages when the leaders are more hands off, just to scare people. I don't know, Kristen, you want to start with that?
Yeah, I really did not have that experience. The leadership team that I worked with was phenomenal. I mean, from the top all the way down. But again, I think it comes back to if there's lack of communication, if there's not support. I mean, learning and development is usually the first position to go when things get tight. And so I think that kind of comes from potentially leadership that doesn't see value in learning and development. And so just really having that solid relationship and talking like we have been about, ROI and what that investment looks like to not take someone away to train. I just think that's really important. But I have to admit, like my experience, I was always extremely supported by our leadership team, not only at the tippy top, but like everyone in between. And when I wasn't, it just came down to a breakdown of communication and we resolved things quickly. So I'm not the best person to answer that, Nick, because I had really good support. I can't imagine having done my job though without it.
So I'll share a story from my experience as both being trained and being like and managing a brokerage, because like I did not do this well for a very long time. Like, one of my biggest challenges as someone who was more hands off with training was that what people were being trained on just wasn't aligned with what the actual reality was on the floor. Like I would say that people would be trained on like XYZ, like sourcing process, right? Like, how do you go about finding a carrier? First, step one, to do this. Step two, you do this. Step three, you do this. And like, that's in our training. Like, people should be doing that. But if I look out onto the floor and I actually pay attention to it and I actually like reinforce that training, I mean, like no one was doing that. And like that turned into a huge problem for us. So, I mean, for me as a manager, like that's when it kind of clicked to me like, oh shoot, maybe I need to be more involved in this than just telling my trainer what to train people on and assuming it is being done that way. So like that lack of alignment for me was a huge problem. What kind of got me more involved eventually.
Yeah, I talk to leaders a lot about, what kind of training that they want us to create or provide, because we have a pretty hefty library in our LMS of all content that we've created. And I get remarks like, oh, we need, sales negotiation training. And I'm like, well, I actually do have that in the library and I have assigned that to people. Did you even know this existed? And like, it just tells me that they're not paying attention to communication, and they're just not on the same page as the rest of the company. So they're really just hurting their teams if they're not engaged in training. And I just don't think that that's fair to everybody at the staff level. So,
yeah. So
I don't have any specific, I guess, stories. Besides the last place I worked, we had zero training. And it was just like, get thrown in, be on a 3-way call, learn how to talk to a customer. And that's about it. That was all the training. So, yeah.
Yeah. So here, I'll move into this question because this is something that I encounter a lot, is just general resistance to training by users and like, I honestly by leaders sometimes. But like how can leadership effectively address resistance to training, right, from their team members? Because you're going to get that sometimes, right? Somebody, probably more experienced folks, right, like who like allegedly know what they're doing and already have their book of business and don't want to be pulled off the floor for an hour a week to do any training. Like what can leaders do to address that?
So I think there are a couple things, and like L&D is certainly a great person to partner with on that. I think to the point of we have senior people who maybe don't even need this training. If they can test out of needing to do the training, then great. So I think if there's an opportunity to work with the manager to create a list of questions that by the end of XYZ training, someone who takes that training should be able to answer anyway. If there are people who can take that up front and they pass it, then like they don't need the training. That's fine. Like maybe not everyone needs it. So like let's respect that and respect their time and say, okay, you got this time back. Like great job. I think on the other hand, the things where I've seen resistance to training, I'll categorize it as like maybe some grumbling on the side, like diminishes the most. Is when I see the leader just lead by example. And I love few things more than like sending out an email about a training that needs to be completed and a manager re-forwarding that email to their team and CCing me and saying, team, I completed this training. It took me 30 minutes. My expectation is that you have completed this training by Friday. I will be checking with Amy on completion. And like quick to the point, and it's just like, listen, like this is part of the job. So I think a lot of people end up working at companies that say, and at brokerages, where they say they do value things like employee development, employee growth. That stuff isn't just going to happen by showing up and not being willing to learn every day. And so I think a leader demonstrating that again and just doing it by example and saying very clearly, these are my expectations and this is what we are all going to do is a really great way of kind of helping against that training resistance.
Another way is to make training required for certain promotions or certain positions.
Mm-hmm.
So like if you didn't train in XYZ, you're not even qualified to apply for this internal position. Once we started putting some rules like that around some things here at Sunset, people took training a lot more seriously. So yeah, that's been working for us.
Something we did was we would give a deadline, like this training needs done by this date. And if it's not, you will be required to meet in the conference room on this other date to finish it. So if you're not willing to take your own time to do it, we'll be pulling you from your seat so that you have the space to do it. And that will be excusable time. But it was kind of like this or that. And they got to choose if they wanted to be in the conference room with 6 other people or 10 other people who hadn't finished it or on their own time. And kind of, it's like kind of giving the choice to a small child that's like, it's my choice what I'm going to decide.
Yeah, that reminds me of something that also we started at Sunset this year. We have a legendary learner policy. So we have compliance courses that we put out every month, just about something, that we need to train on every year. And we don't really have any repercussions if you don't do them on time. But this policy states that if you do each one on time and you take 3 optional learning opportunities, whether it's an in-person session or an optional learning initiative in the library, you qualify as a legendary learner. So there's like at the end of the year, we'll have like a little award ceremony. They get a little trophy, and then they get a chance to spin our prize wheel.
Oh, that's cool.
Ooh, that's nice.
Nice. A little gamification there.
Yeah. Gamification. Exactly.
Do they get like monetary rewards from the prize wheel?
Yes. So the prize wheel, we're going to have some bigger prizes, probably around $500 to $1,000. And we'll randomly choose a couple of them from the pool of learners. We still have, after January, we still had 205 employees still qualifying. So I imagine it's going to be a big list by the end of the year. Everybody's like really excited about it.
Nice.
Okay.
That's awesome.
I do like that a lot.
I was going to say, I feel like the 3 areas that for me that I was constantly kind of focusing attention on for current employees was like IT safety, anything, clicking links and ensuring that our data was protected, ensuring that if we lost everything tomorrow, would we be okay? How would we function? The second thing was fraud. Always new training, new rules, new processes around fraud. And the third thing is new technology, introducing new tech. How do you get your team on board for new technology? And I think if like any leaders listening to those things, I'm sure those are one of those things is pertinent to their operations day to day and things that they're thinking about. And so when you're trying to get leadership on board, they know that if you're not focused on those three things or one of those three things, goodness, like where are you even going as a company? Because you kind of have to buckle up for some of those things. If you're not focused on those places, you could be in trouble. And so that, like, making it relevant and not wasting time. I love, Amy, what you said about like if you test out, you test out, but you have to not waste people's time just like having pointless meetings just to meet.
Yep.
Right, there's statistics behind that. So not wasting people's time so that you can focus on those important things and your business can thrive.
So how often do you meet with leaders to kind of discuss some of these like additional training? Like you mentioned like cybersecurity and fraud and a few other like technology training, which like everyone needs. How often do you meet with leaders to kind of figure out like what direction they want to go with training, or like what topics are important to them? I'm assuming you meet with them like semi regularly at least.
Yeah, I did.
Okay.
It was probably more informal than formal in my setting.
Yeah.
And most of the time it was like, hey, we bought this, go train it, go learn it and go train it. And so it was like, here we go.
Okay. Okay.
I tried to position more of the, I would say kind of like the strategy piece after the books were closed from the fiscal year and we had our results and we understood what leadership's next year goals really were. So if it's we are trying to prevent churn or we are trying to increase sales by X, also navigating that with headcount. There was one year where it was like we are growing like gangbusters and we are going to be hiring like mad. And so onboarding was me and my team's like core focus and making sure that we had really robust programming in place. There have been other years where it's like we are pretty slim on new headcount for this year. Therefore, if we already have a program that we can plug and play or even put it in an e-learning fashion, because we don't have 70 people starting every other week, we have 2 people starting a month, then my team and my efforts can and should be focused on some of these other things like product enablement so that we can help with reducing churn and helping to drive revenue. And so I think helping ensure that what you are doing marries to business goals is really critical. And I found that timing usually comes at around February, March, depending on the fiscal year. I think to that end, what Kristen said, I think continuing to do informal meetings and or set up a cadence wherein it's like, I remember for when I was training carrier sales, it was like we do a monthly L&D carrier sales manager sync. I'm available to you at any time outside of that. And what we also want to do in this is kind of report. I want to report to you on what have I been up to? What have your learners been up to? And I also want to hear from you. What are the changes that we need to make to our roadmap? And what are some outstanding training requests we need to look at and see if we need to adjust kind of, what's in our commitment bank? That those were really powerful to keep happening as well. So all the time and at certain points for strategic purposes.
Yeah. And like we, excuse me, like we found that like even through Sync, us having conversations with the leaders at our company, our customers, it's important to make sure that our training aligns with like their company goals, like even what topics that we're training on, if they have a company-wide initiative of like increasing carrier usage, right? Like that's going to lend itself more, like certain topics are going to lend themselves more to that goal than others, right? So like for us, in terms of like building out training schedules and learning paths and what have you, like it's important for us to be aligned with the leaders to make sure that like we know what courses to be giving people. So all of that really resonated with me. Amy, someone said something, right? No? All right.
Oh, okay.
Amy, you had a question on here I want to touch on. So you had how can we help leaders mitigate the amount of work that comes with implementing training and new behaviors? Do you want to touch on that one at all?
Yeah. So I think I don't totally know the answer to this question either. So I think it's always, kind of great to hear from here. So I'm curious to hear what other people have to say as well. I think where the intent behind that question was, I think that sometimes training can, rightfully so, but potentially incorrectly, be attributed as this like very daunting thing where we are asking people to make these like massive, massive changes. If there is something like that extensive in place, there should ideally be many other people and functions that are on board with that, supporting the change management of it. Everything from like, is this intuitive enough for someone to do this in the product on their own if they don't go through page 46 of this training manual I put together, for instance? So I think to that end, I think it kind of just like behooves everyone to look at, when we think about implementing a training initiative and we think about actually seeing sustained changed behaviors, kind of looking at what are the things that we can prioritize the most within this, because we can't throw a bunch of change to people at one time, and people don't like change. It's uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think in the second piece, saying what is reasonable to train to, and what are things that really just kind of are not. And I'll give the example of some SOPs that I've been tasked with training to before. And I have said to leaders, like, listen, I don't think I could do this process without needing to have the SOP pulled up next to me. It is complicated and it is convoluted. And so either we do a live walkthrough of the SOP and we are in agreement that people will need to continue to use that until they've built the muscle memory around this, or we actually need to bring this back up to, depending on the kind of company you're at, we need to bring this back up to product or to Eng and say like, hey, from a user intuitive perspective, this actually just isn't something that will naturally come to people. And we're going to continue to need to use all of these like funky workarounds. So I guess all that is to say, I think there are, things that we can do as L&D where we say, I'm going to lead a training on this and I need you to do this. And it's also our responsibility to look at it from a higher level and say, from a systems perspective, like, will a training for this even work? And what can we realistically expect from the training? And let's just get on board with that and try to make small incremental progress instead of expecting this like momentous change off of maybe one ILT session.
So I have a question to piggyback on that. Does anybody else want to add to what Amy said at all before I go down this tangent?
No, I think I agree. I don't think I fully have the answer to that as well, but I liked what Amy said.
Okay. So for people in training who don't have industry experience, like what can they do to, I guess, to learn more about the industry and be more educated in how they address some of these things, right? Because what you mentioned about the SOPs, I mean, I know plenty of people who are plenty of brokerages where like the person who manages training is just like Janet in HR, right? And it's just like she's in HR, so we figure she'll train people too, but she really has she's never brokered a load in her life. So like, how does she kind of get the understanding of the industry to be able to identify things of like, well, this isn't working, or like we should train people this way instead, or like this is what we should be training on people on next? Like how does someone without industry experience get there?
That's hard for me to answer because the people that are on my team have been in the operation before. I did have somebody on my team. She doesn't work here anymore, but she did not have industry experience. And so what we did was we had her do the role of what she would be training on for several weeks. So she got a better understanding. I really think that's the only way to do it. Have them shadow or actually have them do the real role. unfortunately, but that's the only way that they're going to be able to empathize and understand how to train somebody in it. So.
I think to add on to that, if we're talking about the case of like a single HR manager who is also overseeing L&D, which is like that's a huge list of responsibilities. And I can only imagine how many times L&D is like the number one priority and then like the 20th priority in the span of a day.
Yeah.
I think to that end, there are like frameworks out there that are like kind of very simple in terms of this is how you just think about a training, that if an HR team member is able to equip managers with that and say, hey, here is kind of like your basic 101 for creating a training on XYZ thing. And I'm not going to go into the whole process right now, but I have a framework that I use. For instance, it's like 9 steps long, and I basically follow the same framework with whatever I'm building. So if the HR person is able to share that framework with other leaders and say like, hey, listen, I am just one person, but I don't want to slow you down. Use this framework and you can build your own training, or have someone on your team who's looking for a growth opportunity and have them build the training so that you aren't the one who's in charge of this and I'm not in charge of it either, but we've given them the tools to do it and they've had this growth opportunity there as well, I think can really work. So I think in those areas, better to not overcommit and say you can do something and then need to not be able to follow through on it, but instead think, how can I provide people with repeatable, reusable resources? And from the manager's perspective, how can I then help the manager make sure that they don't think that they are wholly responsible for it either? Because they aren't necessarily. Again, there are people on the team who are probably looking for growth opportunities. And I think saying to them, hey, I'm going to make you our L&D person is a great way to do that.
So
yeah,
really
I think that
Kristen, go. I'll go after you.
Well, I just piggybacking, I mentioned this before, and I just think street credit's everything. If you don't know, find a way to know. And I leaned on the direct managers so much in my training before I put anything out in front of their team. I wanted their blessing on what I was presenting. And usually they had additions for me or tweaks, or maybe they even put something together, but they wanted help simplifying it so it wasn't so wordy, so we really work together in that way, and it just helps that everything comes back to relationship. The other thing that I wish I would have done more, now that I'm not in that role and I've my eyes are open to different pieces of the industry, I was not active at all on LinkedIn at that time the way I am now, and there are just so many resources. Our industry is very much on LinkedIn, and I'm sure, Nick, you have plenty of thoughts around this coming from your background, and what you do, but there's just so many resources out there and there are people to learn from. And so if it's not your background, like, it's just a little obstacle and you jump through that hoop, and there are plenty of people out there and resources, waiting to help you.
Yes, that's just immerse yourself in the industry, I guess, since we're all kind of in the freight industry. What I recommend people to do, so like our VP of HR, she's never been in the operation. We have an HR generalist, never been in the operation. So I give them accounts that they should follow on LinkedIn, like Freight Caviar is one of them, just so they can start to pick up the lingo. And then what we also do here, we do like department overviews. So I would encourage them to attend all of those so they can see what all the different departments do and how they work together.
Yeah, I'm going to make a comment that's kind of quasi-related to this, but like in my experience, one thing leaders need to do, like that kind of ties along with like the LinkedIn and the networking, kind of seeing what's out there, is like while doing that, kind of understanding like what's going on in other brokerages and just getting that outside exposure sometimes. Like I have 2 prospects that I'm talking to. Hopefully neither one of them is watching. Well, hopefully one of them is watching this. One of them, they've got like 5 carrier sales reps, and like everyone at this company has probably 15 plus years of experience. Like they legitimately know what they're doing. And each one of their 5 carrier reps, they're each booking 30 loads a day. Like they're little machines. And like these people, like they also want want more training. They're like, we could probably work on this, or account managers could work on that. Like, yeah, let's onboard sync and do some things. I have another prospect who, like, yes, they all have a ton of experience, but they all have a ton of experience in one brokerage, right? They didn't come from a bunch of big ones like the other place did. All they know is like how this one brokerage in the middle of nowhere has operated for the past 20 years. And their highest grossing carrier rep is booking 6 loads a day. And their reaction to me is, yeah, man, like, we don't need training. We're crushing it. Our top performing carrier rep is booking 6 loads a day. And I'm just like, okay, guys. I mean, like, the problem with getting too kind of like isolated in what you're doing is you don't know what else is out there and what else you really should be trained on to kind of level up to the rest of the playing field. Quasi-related, I know, but
no, I kind of had a similar experience coming from the old brokerage I was at. Like, we just specialized in produce, so all I knew were reefers, and all I knew was the Pacific Northwest. I didn't really realize how big like brokerage actually is until I came to Sunset. I learned so much more. I mean, different equipment types, different modes of transportation, domestic, international. The world's a really big place for transportation. And so, yeah, you don't really know what you don't know unless somebody, introduces you to it.
Yeah. Like, it even comes up with like technology and stuff, right? Like, I think it's incumbent on leaders to kind of stay up to date on like what's out there, how people are using it, like how other brokers are performing, where you stack up, like, just to kind of identify what the training needs might be for your brokerage. Yeah.
I think all that, to Nick, to your point, can really tie back to like what we talked about at the beginning of this, which is like really just setting expectations and like, why do you need me? So like, yes, I have learning and development after my name. Like, yes, I know training, but often, at least in my experience in brokerages, when I've worked with managers and senior managers, they've been in the industry for a very long time. And they know this stuff like way better than I do. And I will be very forthright in saying like, listen, I can scratch the surface, but like, this stuff. So what is the value add that you are looking for me to bring? Do you want like someone with energy who can like come and lead this training? Like I can do that for you, but I'm going to need you in the room to answer a lot of these questions that I literally will not be able to answer because I don't have your depth of experience. If it is something like negotiation training, I'm probably actually not your best person. I can offer you some books that are great to read and like do a book club around, or like maybe there's someone on your team who is like a superstar at that and you need them to all be shadow, but also look back at your job description and who you've been hiring. And maybe you need to make sure you are hiring people who have prior sales experience instead of hiring people who maybe don't. And we are at a totally different baseline for these people. So I think really like unpacking that, what is your expected impact that I am going to have? Like, why do you want me? Can really help ensure that any kind of engagement is successful so that you don't get to the end of it and people are like, man, Amy, I thought you were going to transform these people into like multi-billion-dollar sellers, when it's like, honestly, I never was going to. That is like out of my realm of capability.
Yeah. We're coming like right up on time. So I think that's probably a good stopping point for us. A good comment to end on. Let's do a quick, just like run around to just give people like who you are, how to contact you if you want to reach out. Like, Amy, we'll start with you.
Sure. So yeah, Amy Malin, feel free to add me on LinkedIn. You'll see my maiden name in there as well, Ostrowski. And I can be emailed at ostrowskiamy@gmail.com.
Erica?
All righty. Erica Winston, Sunset Transportation. There you go. If you type it in LinkedIn, you can find me there. Best way to contact me is probably on LinkedIn as well. So anybody that is in L&D, any kind of organizational development, transportation, like, I would love to connect and just bounce ideas off of each other. So.
And Kristen, you're up.
And I think my biggest regret previously in my role was not connecting better with a network outside of my institute, my group. So yes, I would have done that, Erica. That would have been me. Kristen at Q'd. My email's kristen@q'd.com. I'm on LinkedIn. We're everywhere.
All right. Sounds good, everybody. Audience, thanks for watching. And that does it. Thanks, guys.
All
Thanks,
right.
Thank you.
everyone. Thanks,
Bye.
Nick. Bye.
Bye.